I realized after I left last week that there's a bunch of things I hadn't said. I did find some interesting pictures because of Oktoberfest. I went back through my Germany souvenirs.
Oh.
Remember the picture of myself in the pulpit?
Yes.
There is the room.
Was that the one that's in the middle of the room you're talking about?
Well, yes, yeah. It's halfway back and it's halfway up the wall.
That's the picture of the thing you were in.
Yes, right. There's right it is. And here, I told you about the altar being, the legs were angels standing. This is that altar. And the very prominent organ, which was Luther. This is a Catholic church at Torgau, Germany.
Catholic church still?
No, it's Lutheran.
Oh.
But Luther was in charge of remodeling the worship space. And the major changes he made was freestanding altar, not against the wall. It took Lutherans a long, long time to adopt that. I mean, the altar against the wall. The very early church had freestanding altars, we know that. But what happened, and the reason we ended up with altars against the wall, one was the notion that God is out there somewhere, so the pastor's addressing God. The other thing was churches got built over the tombs of saints. Well, the tombs of saints made their way into the actual altar. I actually did this is a great story, in Italy. And I, being the kind of person that I am, we were touring this church, and we walked behind the great high altar, and there was a little narrow, short opening in the back of the altar. And so, me being who I am, I get down on my hands and knees and I crawl into this opening into the hole under the altar, and nose to nose with a skeleton. And I'm like thinking, I'm probably not supposed to be in here. But the altars also became tombs of saints. And many of the early churches, the first churches that were built over the tombs of saints. St. Peter's in Rome is built over the supposed location of the burial of St. Peter.
Can I have just a moment?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So was this church once a Catholic church and it became Lutheran?
I don't know, it's all in German, I can't read it.
Come on,
So,
dude.
yeah, I'm sorry.
If we're having Oktoberfest, I think the rules are we have to know German.
I'm in it.
I don't know German, but I'm not hosting the Oktoberfest. Really? Well, I'm calling your bluff, do it.
Okay. I also pulled out some other, besides that church, I'm going to pass these around. This is not the castle church in Wittenberg. This is the parish church in Wittenberg, Germany. Luther's 95 Theses nailed on the door of the castle church. But this is the town square in Wittenberg, and this is a statue of Philip Melanchthon, and the statue of Luther is the one in the back. The big church in the back is St. Mary's Lutheran Church, St. Mary's, because it was St. Mary's before Luther, before the Reformation. It was here that I told you there was destruction going on of statues and windows and that sort of thing, that Luther came back to Wittenberg to stop. So that is the church. There's an interesting bit of anti-Semitism in that church. It's now in a museum that's attached to the church, but there was a carving of a pig that used, and this would have been true at the time of Luther, that was on the outside of the church. Every Jew in town was forced to kiss the rear end of that pig once a year.
Really?
Yeah.
Is this?
And that was at that church. And Luther would have known about that carving.
Now there's two of these, right?
Yeah, the one in front is Melanchthon.
Okay, this is
That's Luther. Yeah.
Okay, Melanchthon.
This is what I told you. Luther grew a beard, and when he went into hiding at the Wartburg Castle, this is a painting of him at that time. And I pulled this out, this is a painting by the same artist as Lucas Cranach the Elder, showing Luther here with his beard as a young monk, and then Luther in later years as we kind of know, we recognize. And I'll pass this one around too. This is the house that Luther was born in Eisenach, Germany. So.
He was not poor.
His family was actually solidly middle class. I don't remember what his dad did. His dad wanted him to be a lawyer.
They were born into like peasants, weren't they?
They weren't really peasants. They were middle class, which in late medieval and early Renaissance time, there weren't many people that were actually middle class. You had peasants and you had the nobility and a small middle class. Luther's family was actually middle class. I brought along some show and tell. Because it occurred to me that I hadn't talked at all about vestments and why we Lutherans wear vestments.
What's the definition of the vestment?
What clergy wear.
Okay, that makes sense.
Robe.
To be vested, I mean, there's a legal term for vested, means
Yeah.
but there's also a clothing to wear a vest.
So it just means like the clergy uniform.
Essentially, yeah. The primary thing is called an alb. See, it was in Greek in ancient times, at the time of Jesus. This was streetwear. This is what in Greek and Roman and Middle Eastern society people wore daily wear. Yes, very similar. You'll sometimes see clergy wearing these with a rope around the waist.
I was gonna ask you that, because I've always seen it with a rope.
This was just not designed to wear a rope with. The rope, and that really was part of it, if you were a laborer. And what the rope around your waist was, you tightened that up, and then you lifted the bottom of the thing up over the rope to about knee height, so that you didn't get this all mucked up in the fields or whatever you were working on. This was streetwear in the ancient world. Clergy then wear a bit of colored cloth around the neck. It's called a stole, and we don't know what its history is, except that clergy have been wearing them since God was little, as far as we know. What we think happened was because everybody was dressed like this. Well, maybe.
Thinking just one.
It wouldn't have been just one, but everybody was wearing these. Imagine the whole congregation dressed like this, in a white robe. We think that probably clergy adopted just something around the neck that was colored, so that they would stand out. Now, liturgical colors weren't codified in the early church, but we think that they just piece of colored cloth around the neck so that they knew who was in charge. Well, the other thing that happened in the early church, and this is called a chasuble. It comes from the Latin or Greek phrase, and Greek and Latin actually, called a cassula. Or it's called a chasuble, but it comes from the Greek word cassula, which meant little house. And the cassula, if you can kind of envision this, was simply a cone-shaped coat. Went over the house, and it was cone-shaped, and went all the way to the ground, all the way around. We don't know how this happened, but for some reason or another, clergy continued to wear their coats in church. Now, maybe this time it was for a while. But the problem was, you're presiding at communion particularly, and you've got communion vessels to handle, and your coat that you're wearing goes all the way to the floor. So,
You're pulling things up
then getting, okay. The Eastern and the Western Church had completely different solutions to the problem. In the Western Church, they just cut off the edges, ending up with something shaped like this. Now, that's what the Western Church did. In the Eastern Church, they made a cut in the front so that you get your arms up the front of the thing. So in the Eastern Church, if you go to an Orthodox service, the chasuble is shaped like that. It goes all the way to the floor in the back and is open in the center in the front, up to about like a cape, more like a modern cape. But in the Western Church, they just whacked off the edges so that you get your arms out the edge. And in the Eastern Church, they cut out the middle so that you get your arms out the middle. That's and then, you know, as liturgical colors became a part of the life of the church, they started doing these in the colors.
When did that start?
Early, by the 6th century anyway. Now, they've changed over the years, and not every community used the same colors. It took them a long time to codify that, but
So by the time Luther was around,
it was already established, yeah.
okay.
And over the years, the colors have changed. For example, Advent was originally, the color assigned to Advent was blue, and then Advent took on more and more of the character of Lent in the church. It became a penitential season. They changed it to purple, which was the color for the season of Lent. In the Roman, this just happened in my lifetime. The Roman Church color for a funeral was black. You can still buy black vestments, but nobody uses them. Color actually for funerals should be white, because it's a festival of the resurrection.
Yeah.
It's very Chinese, they always associated white with death.
Exactly the opposite of where Western culture, because we associate black with death. But you're right, in Chinese culture, white is associated with death. In the West, white, very early, white and gold got associated with the resurrection. And so the tradition is white for Easter, Christmas, and then some. And saints' days, this is completely esoteric. If the saint was a martyr, the color is red. If the saint died of natural causes, it's white.
So it depends on what.
So it depends. And you know if it's a festival of the saints, you know whether they were martyred or whether they died a natural death. Which comes to the question that Debbie was talking about. What do Lutherans believe happens to us when we die?
Now be careful here. Because this is gonna depend on when I decide I'm gonna die.
Before we get into the discussion,
Okay.
I have a question about this.
Yeah.
Did he go under a pseudonym?
Yes.
Did you talk about that?
Yes, it was Junker George.
Right.
Oh, the
Luther, when he was in hiding, yes, he went under a pseudonym. And it only because he didn't even know that the Elector of Saxony, who I don't remember now who it was, it's escaping me, that he was going to be kidnapped. That was a surprise to Luther, but it got explained to him very quickly that he was just on his way back to Wittenberg from where from Worms, and he gets kidnapped, and it's the Elector of Saxony that did that and hid him away in Wartburg Castle, where Luther stayed for darn near a year. And that's when he was translating the Bible from.
very Rasputin looking.
Yes, yeah. So to David's question about what we teach about, I'm gonna kind of give traditional teaching and some things that I believe. We affirm in the creeds the resurrection of the body. The early church believed that it believed in resurrection, but only in the last days when Christ returned. There is both a Hebrew and a Greek way of looking at death, and there's two different words. If the Hebrew talks about spirit, Greek talks about soul. And those are different concepts. Spirit, in both Hebrew and in Greek, in the languages, the same word for spirit, in Hebrew it's ruach, and in Greek it's pneuma.
Well, I can't spell either one of those. Well, I'll just put it down.
Well, let's see, I can...
No, I didn't.
It's clear your throat or roll your eyes.
Right, yeah. Both of those mean either breath or spirit. It's the same word. So, when God breathes into mud guy at creation, what does he get? Breath. Or spirit. Greeks had the notion of an immortal soul. That comes from the Greeks. Hebrews didn't believe in the early in Old Testament times, or at least the early Old Testament times, they didn't believe in life after death. Hebrews didn't.
But they had the witch of Endor that was resurrected.
Well, yes, but that's a kind of a special case kind of thing. It was not common Hebrew belief. At the time of Abraham, for example, the whole thing about him having a child is so darn important, because that's how you continued after death, was in your children. There was no resurrection. But the Greeks had this notion of dying and ending up in the Elysian fields. If you remember your Greek mythology, which was kind of like a quasi-heaven. But it was also kind of a shadow world, is maybe a better way to think about it. It wasn't really life after death. It was just kind of a continued existence in a different place. That was the Greek notion, and those two notions got kind of blended together in early Christian thought.
So they kind of had this, whatever it is, were they still in a body form, or no?
No, at least not necessarily. They didn't see that as a bodily thing. They thought of it as being what we would think of as a spirit world, in a kind of thing. We still affirm the resurrection of the body, but it's been a long time from Jesus to now, and what has happened to all of those folks who passed on in between. What I sometimes talk about is, when we die, our breath, God who gave it to us in the first place, goes back to God. And that may not be as conscious. I mean, it depends on what you think about consciousness after death, quite frankly. I tend to believe in consciousness after death, but the resurrection ain't happening until Jesus returns. I mean, so I believe we go back to God in one form or another. And here's where I'm gonna probably be teaching absolute heresy. This is my personal belief. I don't believe in heaven and hell in the traditional sense of it. I just plain don't. I believe we go on. I believe that we are spiritual beings and that we continue on and continue on in a kind of some kind of level of consciousness. I am a universalist. I believe that everyone is saved. Doesn't matter what we believe. But I like, we associate hell with fire. I like the passage of Jesus that says we go through like a refining fire, which turns the ore into precious metal. And you keep the precious metal and you get rid of the rest of the junk. Well, and, you know, anybody that has ever knows anything about making iron or gold or silver or any of those things, you know, you heat up the ore, and you get the thing that you want, and the rest of the stuff, you throw away. I believe, because I also think there needs to be, and this is just my sense of justice, that if someone is truly evil and does horrible things in this life, there has to be something, God has to do something about that.
But aren't we all irredeemably evil?
Well, yes, yeah, but,
Child breaker.
but, yeah, I mean,
There's no defining between the two, it's sin is sin.
yes, and we affirm that. I think that's for this life, and so that we don't end up in judgment of each other. But the image of the refiner's fire, I think, is useful, and maybe not literal. I'm not a literalist when it comes to this stuff, but maybe if one is really, really evil in this life, and you go through this process, there ain't nothing left.
Oh, well, that makes some sense.
They're just plain ain't nothing. Not that it's a punishment in the sense that we think of going to hell for eternity and suffering, which is how this is frequently presented in the churches, right?
Yeah.
But rather, you know, once that process, once we've died and gone through that process, there ain't nothing left. That's again, this is purely me.
Sure.
This is purely me. Like I say, I'm probably teaching a complete and total heresy here, but
Because I have grappled with heaven and hell also, and I guess you could say I toyed with the idea that, well, I read an article one time, and this physician who took care of the elderly, he had quite a few near-death experience patients that
Mhm.
almost died, but they came back and they told, and he was curious. So he creates this bed, kind of like a modern hospital bed that will weigh you, only this one would weigh you like to the ground or to the, whatever. And when he knew somebody was near the end, with their permission, he put them on this bed. And after 200 or something deaths and measuring the weight of the person at the time of death, he didn't know what to make of it, but he discovered that at the time of death, they were all like 3/4 of an ounce lighter
yep.
from
I know
before
that
death
study.
and after death. And that gave him cause to think, like, as the spirit leaves, maybe the spirit actually had blame. But in toying with that same idea you're talking about, I think we're all eternal in that sense. Our spirits are eternal. And I'm like, but then where does heaven and hell come in? And I kind of wonder, and I don't know, if you have an evil spirit at the time of death, and you leave, maybe you seem to still be at that evil plane, whereas I don't know what the words are, a more righteous person might be on a higher level. I don't know.
Well, and see, we are talking about stuff that there's no answer
There
to.
is no.
I can say what the traditional church teaching is, but I personally don't find that terribly helpful. So,
Let's all admit there is an answer, we just may not know it till we die.
Right.
Exactly.
Exactly.
My friend, the professor, he's the guy that did the translation,
Yes,
who
yes.
says, anytime somebody in class would come up with a question that he didn't know the answer, he says, I don't know, but when you get to heaven, ask around.
Yeah.
And so there, to come back to this, we don't have Lutherans. Just like you ask 40 of us, even clergy, about that same question, you're going to get 40 different answers.
Well, besides, I think as I grew up, I always thought, if you're saved, because I grew up in the Southern Baptist religion, you have to be saved, and I was saved at 9 years old because I was scared to death that hell was gonna get me, so I thought I better do something about it pretty quick. So I did, and then I tried to be righteous. Well, being righteous as a 9-year-old was not an easy job, and when you were Debbie Johns, it was definitely not an easy job.
Well, Luther said we're both righteous and sinners.
Yes.
And finished. But see, I didn't know that. See, I was just trying to be righteous, which Kathy probably knows too.
Yeah.
That when you're raised in the Southern Baptist Church, and so then you go to the altar again to repent of whatever you did wrong, whether it took the candy bar or you kicked your sister or whatever you did, you know.
Cause it was wet.
Yeah, but whatever. But you know, the thing that I guess I always thought then, we died, and if we were righteous and holy, we would go up, and if we weren't, we would go down. And I was hoping I was gonna go up. Well, I always thought that meant when you passed, your spirit went on up, and you were conscious, but maybe not in the form that you were just were conscious. Then, the Presbyterians just about did me in when they said, we just slept there until
the resurrection.
Until the resurrection.
Yep.
Well, I'm thinking that could be a real long time, you know.
You
That could be.
wouldn't know.
You what?
You won't know if
No.
you're asleep.
Right.
That's right, you're asleep. So I figured if we're asleep, I want something pretty good to sleep on this whole time. I'm thinking about this. Well, I'm being funny, but I mean,
Oh, yeah.
serious, isn't it?
Well,
You know?
You don't wanna wake up with a crick in your neck.
No.
exactly. Which can happen after a couple thousand years of sleep, right?
Well, you know, and now, there is a big, thing about people being cremated,
Mhm.
which really upsets me because I can't, now I realize people, when, you know, Mike and I discussed it, and I said, no, I can't handle that. So, because I feel like we need to be the whole body. Well, that's some of my upbringing.
I'm sorry, but I really wanna mention this. I saw something on YouTube like yesterday about cremation being sent into space, and I was thinking about the resurrection. So when they come back, are they just gonna be floating out in space past Pluto, having to find their way back? I know that's not gonna, but yeah.
That's where this whole thing gets really complicated.
Mhm.
And we can, and like I said, we can speculate endlessly.
About
the-
what?
What's that?
What was it? What was it
Well,
About what happens after death and all that
Oh,
stuff. I mean, we can speculate endlessly. We can use the biblical imagery and go somewhere with it if we want to. By the way, in the New Testament, almost every reference to hell is not hell in a literal sense. The word in Greek is Gehenna.
Isn't that a peaceful place though?
It was. At the time of Jesus, Gehenna was the garbage dump for Jerusalem. It was a valley, and that's where they took all the trash. And as a kid, I grew up, our school was right next to where the city dump was.
Oh.
And,
That didn't go real well there.
well, if the wind was in the wrong direction. And just as in ancient Gehenna in Jerusalem, there was always a fire.
Yeah.
They were, I mean, because they would burn up the stuff that would burn. And yeah, I mean, depending on what was burning, it would smell really bad, or the garbage or whatever. I mean, it was an unpleasant place. That is why the notion of hell has fire,
Oh.
Yeah.
and it's just a really nasty place.
And when you're talking to Jewish people where cleanliness is so important, Jesus would say, it's better not to be over in Gehenna, you know?
Exactly.
So that would be a really.
That's gonna be a whole lot worse
That would
than,
be as bad as saying, oh, you're gonna be sentenced to the ghetto over here, you know, if you don't do right, you know?
Mhm.
So,
yep, yeah.
That's the ghettos.
So our notions about death are informed not just by Hebrew thought, but by Greek thought, because St. Paul was the first cross-cultural communicator.
Oh,
Because
very good.
he was the Jew who spoke Greek fluently and addressed the Greek audience that he primarily did his ministry to. What's that?
And Rome, didn't you go to Rome?
Paul did go to Rome, but everybody who was educated in Rome could speak Greek.
Oh, I didn't know that.
We have no evidence that Paul knew any Latin, but if you were educated in Rome, you spoke Greek as well as Latin.
I did not know
Just like in Europe, if you're well educated, you speak English,
Or
pretty
just
fluent.
Latin.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, most schools don't teach Latin anymore, but there was a time in history when that was true.
Edinburgh era, that was Latin.
Well, up until 100 years ago, Latin was taught in most schools in the United States. At the high school level.
As an option.
Yeah.
Option B.
So, well, like I said, 100 years ago.
Mother had Latin. My mother dropped out, being a sophomore in high school. She had Latin, she knew Latin.
I had Latin in elementary school, in the Catholic school. So-
Well,
Mother
and
was
particularly
an
Catholic
Anglo, so
school
you-
would teach Latin because this is the pre-Vatican II.
Yeah.
And the Catholic Church did have at least some concern that people understood the Mass.
Yeah.
Plus, didn't you go to
We
school
weren't
in
allowed to
Spain?
have Bibles.
Didn't you go to elementary school in Spain?
No, she was born,
No, I was born in Spain. I grew up in Europe and South America.
Oh, okay.
Various places. My dad was in construction,
Okay.
and we moved around quite a bit.
So I didn't answer your question, which is, to me, is in some ways unanswerable.
But you can't answer my question.
Well,
Actually.
Exactly,
No.
exactly. I can kind of give you the background. I tend to believe, and here again, I may be talking complete heresy, but the Celts talked about places in the universe that were thinner. That is, that the veil between the spirit world and our world is thin. And I talked about this with the priest who was my priest in South Dakota, the Episcopal priest, and who has studied Celtic mythology and early Celtic Christianity. He said, I believe that there are spots in the world that are naturally thin like that, and he says, I also believe there are spots in the world that we've worn thin. And he said, sometimes you walk into an old, he said, particularly an old church, not necessarily a beautiful church, but an old church, and you'll feel like you're on the back of your neck. I've had that happen a couple of places in the world. One of them was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. I walked through the door and was almost knocked to my knees. The other place was the Pantheon in Rome, which was built by Hadrian as a pagan temple, and has been dedicated to all the gods.
Yeah.
And I find this little factoid fascinating. It was dedicated to all the gods, built by Hadrian, and then when it was turned into a church, it became All Saints Church.
Ah, that is fascinating.
I think that's just an interesting little bit of the story.
That is fascinating.
But I also felt it there. It was like, oh my word. There are other spots where I have had that experience, but those are the two that I remember most clearly. I think, again, I go back to this is just me thinking, that there is that the notion, the Greek notion, or the Hebrew notion of spirit as breath is irrelevant, but the Greek notion of a kind of consciousness continuing after death is also relevant. And that the notion of heaven being up here somewhere beyond Pluto and hell being down here somewhere in the center of the world, first of all, that's a layered notion of the cosmos that hasn't been around since Galileo, or sooner, or before that even. We know enough that you know the center of the, you know, how the Earth is laid out, and that space continues, you know, that you can't get beyond Pluto and then suddenly you're in heaven. So that there's got to be something about the spiritual world, and you know, I know that we human beings are spiritual. I've had way too much experience to say that we're not spiritual. But how that all works, the mechanics of it, I have no clue.
Nobody does.
No one does.
Didn't they used to believe that the bottom part of the brain is what connected the soul to the...
Yeah, I mean, I say yes to that. I honestly know that that's the case. But there's all kinds of things. Greeks thought of the soul as being, we talk about having a gut level feeling about something. They believed that the spirit, the soul, was in the abdomen, not here.
I don't know
And
when
not here at the heart either, but in the gut.
sometimes when you look at a person and they're alive, you see video games, you see that they can't get the eyes to be exactly like a human. That's because in a belief that I was at was that you could see somebody's soul through their eyes. And then when they die, you can't see the soul when their eyes are open. The same thing with a video game. They can detail the game to their eyes as much as possible to make it look like, hey, there's a living soul in there. But it's not. It won't happen because there is no soul in the persons in the game.
Same with like CGI movies.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about that. I just.
Well, and that's legitimate, but going back to the original question is, there's nobody that can completely answer that with any real satisfaction.
Yeah, true.
Well, I
That
think-
just, I mean, you know, we've got the biblical images and we've got what the tradition has taught us, which I think a lot of it is horse hockey, quite frankly.
Got it. Just when we go.
Yeah, that's when you get there.
Yeah, I guess I'm comfortable with that, and it's like, do we really affirm the resurrection? Well, we do, because it's in the creeds. Do I really believe that? I'm not sure. But I do. Just like for Jews, they still look to the coming of the Messiah. They're waiting. For Christians, it's waiting for the return of the Messiah. It's, in both cases, it's exactly the same expectation. And a friend, a rabbi, a friend of the guy that the New Testament professor that was my friend, once said, and he said, the Messiah can never come because it's living in the tension.
Oh, wow.
It's important.
The expectation.
The expectation is what's important. It's like you know, Christmas morning is always a kind of a little bit of a disappointment.
Yeah. Yeah, your children are like.
Especially for kids.
Biscuit.
I mean, yeah, I mean, it's always a little bit of a letdown. That's an interesting thing to think about in terms of the coming of the Messiah or the return of the Messiah, depending on, you know, what we're looking at. That maybe the Messiah can never come. I think that's a fascinating idea. I don't know that I'm not going to teach that, but I think it's interesting to think about.
That sounds like heresy.
I told you. I warned you
already.
that this conversation could easily lead into
But we're
heresy.
supposed to think and wonder because we were given free will, and even angels do not have free will.
Well, and Luther said we didn't have free will either. He said our will was actually in bondage. Bondage to who? Satan. That given free will, we always make the wrong choice.
Yeah.
If there was no free will in the angels, then how did they rebel and have to fall?
Oh, yeah, okay.
And
That
I told you it's smart.
That again leads into the same kind of where do we go with this eventually kind of question.
Yeah.
It ultimately and finally is unanswerable, and the biblical evidence on the fallenness of angels is scarce and thin. Doesn't tell us much. Our notions of heaven and hell, by the way, don't show up in the church until about the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Think about the paintings of Hieronymus Bosch, Dutch painter. Look him up online. Hieronymus Bosch, B-O-S-C-H, I believe. He did paintings of hell that were colorful and really fascinating and really scary.
This is around the time that Dante's Inferno.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, same period, late medieval period, early Renaissance. Same time as Luther, by the way. Approximately, not exactly, but approximately the same. Anyway, I didn't get done with, so I'm going to leave that because we've got other things to cover. And like I said, I didn't do this to give you answers to the questions. I just threw out some more stuff to think about.
Yeah,
But
it's
you
well-
also set the precedence, it's okay for us to think differently and still live harmoniously in the churches.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's okay.
Can I
Th-
add
this
a
is- this-
sermon?
This is one of the things that when the years I spent as an Episcopalian, that I really loved about the Episcopal Church that was different from being Lutheran. And that is, the Episcopal Church, what holds the Episcopal Church together is not an agreement on doctrine. It's not on what we teach, it's that we pray together.
In the monarchy.
And, well, the bishops, which are the representation of the in the modern world. Well, we,
British monarchy.
Episcopalians had a heck of a time when, in 1776, in the Revolution, because the prayer book, which goes back to Queen Elizabeth, the prayers in there for the king or queen,
Yeah.
and the Americans who were Anglican were like,
They're not gonna do that.
we've got to revise the prayer book because we're not praying for the King of England. And so in Episcopal prayer book, there are the president, prayers for the President of the United States, Governor of the state, Mayor of the city. But we're not praying for the King of England. But that was a real crisis for the Anglican Church in the United States when we became independent from England.
My dad's Episcopal prayer book from like the 1960s or something. It had the patriotic hymn section, God bless America, my country to the day, God save the Queen.
Well, and that's because that has nothing to do with for Americans, because the prayer book was the Lutheran Book of Worship had God Save the Queen in it, because it was used in Canada.
Ah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
And the prayer book was designed also for English-speaking Canadians. Yeah, that's why God Save the Queen was in the Episcopal hymnal, but it was also in the Lutheran Book of Worship, for exactly the same reason, because that book was published for Canadians as well as,
that makes sense.
as Americans.
Yes, it did.
And Canada is
Still
a Commonwealth who still recognizes, when the
Before then, they were still part of England or part
well,
of.
yeah, I mean, they didn't do a revolution, they just separated gently from England and view the Queen as their queen. And so when she visits Canada, she's not visiting a foreign country.
No.
She has her own palace there.
Yeah. So anyway, that's where that comes from. It has nothing to do with the whole or with the
Oh, okay.
with the I wanted to one other vestment that I wanted to talk about.
Beautiful.
This is called a cope, and this one is purple. I have a white one also.
COPE.
COPE,
Oh, not Kate.
not cape. My guess is that it has the same roots though.
COPD.
And interestingly enough, it's not an ancient, it's more medieval in its origins.
Did you ever wear the hood up or just?
No, never, and the hood is not really made to be worn up, it's purely decorative.
You could be a Jedi if you did that.
Yeah, well, and the hood on my alb I never wear up, I have to put it up to put the trouser on over it, but I never wear it up. It makes me look a little, way too much like a
Jedi.
Klan
Druid.
I was gonna say Jedi.
But the cope was worn and is worn in modern liturgical use as a processional vestment. And it's because in medieval times,
Surprised they didn't put a cape on it.
and here's why. You see movies that take place in Middle Ages or what have you, and the lords, the wealthy, and the clergy
And Cardinal Richelieu.
wear these long capes. When they're wearing them, they drape over the butt of the horse.
Oh, yeah.
That's what it was for. Just to hide the horse's nether parts.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness.
Well, that makes sense.
It does.
Oh, my
I never-
That is really, and it's long enough. I mean, if I was horseback
Yes.
And through this back, it would go down over the horse's back.
And also to hide the minister's nether part.
Well, now it's open in the front.
And then when it poops and you get off the horse, you got a poop stain on top.
Well, in medieval times, if you didn't have poop on you, you weren't doing anything, quite frankly.
Yeah.
But and what happened was the clergy, when they got off their horses, left the cape on when they entered the church until they get up front and got out of it and got into, or were wearing their other vestments underneath it.
So it also denoted that they were clergy if they came out.
Well, at least minor nobility.
Yeah, okay.
In the Norwegian Lutheran Church, the pastors wear rough collars. The looking like a painting, an Elizabethan painting.
Yeah.
With that stands out. The reason is, when you became clergy in Norway, you became minor nobility.
Inheritable or?
Not inheritable. Yeah, wasn't passed, but it was, but just like if you are a chaplain in the military, you are a lieutenant. You are a lieutenant. I don't remember which, but the most minor of the lieutenant orders.
Lower rank.
Lowest rank of lieutenant, but you are a lieutenant. You're an officer. Yeah. And some chaplains actually may go further up on the chain, even though they don't ever carry weapons. But anyway, that's that business of clergy being minor nobility. No matter what class you were born to, in Norway, you are, to this day, you are minor nobility.
They saw nobility in Norway? I don't know how that works.
Well, it's not in the same way that England does, but those families, yeah, there is, just like, we have in the United States, we don't call them nobility, but the wealthy, the old moneyed families still have a certain amount of power that goes with just the name.
The name, yeah.
But that's not the same as
It's not the same,
because
but it's similar.
If
But
that name could be sullied, then it wouldn't be.
right, and you're right. Whereas if you're nobility in Europe, you still, no matter how badly you mess up your name, it's still your name. I mean, you still are respected as nobility. But we have the same kind of notions. And I'm just pointing that out, and clergy who don't understand that we have a certain amount of power are dangerous, because then it's real easy to abuse power. We've seen it in the Catholic Church in spades. Now, there's some reasons for that. It's part of it is the one thing that I said, the Vatican II did not do was allow married clergy in the Catholic Church. You can't keep suppressing people's sexuality and expect there to be no fallout from that. Because it does. You force people into celibacy, it's gonna come out in weird ways. And we have seen, but it's not just the Catholic Church is the only church that's had some sex scandals. It's just that they're the largest, and I believe it's because of the forced celibacy. But it happens, and it happens in other churches, and it happens whenever you have people who have power and think they can use it against people who are under them. Don't even get me started on our
Or
privilege.
it's not just
Well
religion,
said.
it's in the entertainment and politics.
Exactly.
It's all over.
It's across the board.
I'll never forget one of the discussions about women becoming clergy in the old ALC before the merger. When I was at seminary, we had a female professor, and somebody said to her when she was becoming a pastor, she said, this guy said to her, he said, the female clergy scared the heck out of me. He said, I'll be attracted to her.
Oh,
And this woman looked at him and said, "Welcome to the club."
Yeah.
And she was also attracted to her?
Well, not in general. I mean, she was saying, we women have been attracted to the male clergy forever. And so it's about time that we play the field in the opposite direction.
So that
Talking to
they will
Cincinnati
in
Club.
turn,
Yeah.
but it's because male clergy normally have, no matter, they seem to have some sort of power or.
They have a presence. They have-
Presence,
They have
yes.
a powerful presence, yes.
And that is generally given, handed over to us by the folks that we've been asked to serve.
Yes, but we want
And-
you to lead us.
Well, exactly.
Legally,
And,
we are
but
sheep.
it's real easy to let that go to your head and start to abuse it.
Yes. because people-
I always tell people, you know, and I'm really honest about this, I'm a control freak. Big time control freak. And I said that what makes me different from most control freaks is most control freaks won't admit it.
Yeah, that's-
And if somebody calls me on my being a control freak, it's like, yeah, I am. Sorry. Try not to be, but I am.
well, see, but, those of us who have our own OCD appreciate that, we understand that, and we don't, you know,
Well, exactly.
you're not faulted for it. It's-
Right, and
we
I
accept
certainly
it.
try to keep it under control.
I'm
And,
not right.
and anybody who's a good leader is gonna be somewhat of a control freak.
Right, because that's how they lead.
Exactly right.
I know.
So, but it's also a dangerous thing, and it can lead to all kinds of really ugly stuff if it's not kept.
We're not
Are we?
Well.
Well, we
that-
are kinda, but
Well-
the fact of that, there's a fine line between leadership and control.
Yeah.
Well, and I would say not control, but abuse.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Great
well,
power,
if you
What,
go
what
on-
about,
responsibility.
what about those that are like females that are attracted to guys with power?
Well, it's exactly the same thing, that's my
Don't
point,
let
that's
the
that's the
politician-
point I'm making, is that
Or a woman
people
in power?
give to clergy a certain amount of power.
Yeah.
And
And then they abuse
it's, then it can be abused. I mean,
Okay,
once
yeah.
power is handed over,
Mhm.
then
You can take it.
then you can take it and run with it, and
It's-
it leads to,
I've-
it can
I've
lead
seen
to
that.
abuse.
I've seen where they get, women are attracted to priests and stuff, and priests take advantage of it, they abuse it, the women see that, they don't like it, and then problems begin.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and if you don't, I'll
It's
never
crazy.
forget this.
It's crazy
I was sitting in a car with members of my first parish. And I was sitting next, the husband was driving, I was sitting and riding shotgun, and his wife was sitting back behind me, and it wasn't long, and the wife had her hand down my shirt.
Oh,
Whoa.
Already?
Oh, already,
Her
huh?
husband sitting here,
How long'd you know her? No.
and this couple, they were good friends of mine, I mean,
Yeah.
two of them, and I couldn't go. You know, because I would have called attention to it. I have never in my life been so incredibly uncomfortable.
Well, yeah.
It would have been worse if the husband was okay with it.
oh my gosh, we don't wanna go even there.
Well, and yeah,
Oh, man.
and we never talked about it, and probably I should have addressed it, but I just chose to never talk about it, and never put myself into that position again.
So you never sat next to a woman ever again?
No, not this particular. And, you know, she wasn't sitting next to me, she's sitting behind me. Anyway, so that kind of stuff can happen, and if you're the kind of person that's, yeah. I mean, it's real easy to see how something, I mean, first of all,
So innocent.
yeah, I mean, so that stuff that does happen, and like,
I have a friend whose husband died, and she transferred her neediness over to the preacher who was helping her do the funeral arrangements, and you know, suddenly she was thinking that.
it's
yeah,
transfer.
He was gonna,
More intimate. but-
yeah,
Well,
so,
my sister-in-law, my brother Dan, sister-in-law that was here on Easter, yeah. And I hope it's gonna come to the Oktoberfest. Her second husband was a Methodist pastor.
Oh,
She went to him to talk about the breakup of her first marriage and process that.
Well, that doesn't sound very professional.
it
As
happened.
I would say, hell no, but
It happened.
it happened, and then
But how
he
did
took
they,
horrible advantage of her, and
but how did the church bless that union then?
he moved to a different.
Oh, 'cause that doesn't, that
Parish.
seems like you would be defrocked for something like that.
You could, but had she made a fuss about, had someone made a fuss about it at the time, it probably would have caused issues. But nobody made a fuss about it. He transferred to another parish. She went with, and married him.
And they didn't know who she was.
And they didn't know that past history, and the guy she was his third wife after the divorce, and after she was completely broke after divorcing him, because he took her money and bought a house that he tore apart and then didn't put back together again.
Why?
Who knows?
And also the third wife should have been a clue.
Exactly, and she contacted both of the previous wives after her experience, and after she pulled herself together again after a failed marriage. Talked to all three ex-spouses had to file bankruptcy. after the divorce.
Oh, okay. What a
I mean,
strange
this
thing.
guy was, but he was, again, if you don't recognize that you've got some power, or you do it and you decide you're going to abuse it, but a lot of times it's abuse of power because they don't understand that it's there.
I don't know if everyone's that many people that naive, but I guess as far as their own influence.
At least clergy are. I went to seminary with some very incredibly naive people. Because oftentimes clergy come from sheltered backgrounds.
And they don't realize how.
And they don't realize how crazy things are.
What's a sheltered background? Is it like a building like I was in?
Kinda like Andy Griffith.
Well, not like that, but their parents protected them from the realities of life. That's what I mean by sheltered background.
Oh.
Well, how manipulative people can really
Well, everybody, oh,
So, I mean, that's a long way around, but that's, yeah. The other thing that I started to talk about was that historically, sacraments have become minimalized. That originally, baptisms were done, at least with the baptized standing in water up to their waists and having like lots of water poured over them. Down to medieval times when they were sprinkled. Partly because if it was cold in Europe, you didn't want to get a baby really wet, because it might make them sick. But water got to be just the sprinkling. In the Orthodox Church, babies, they baptize babies, but they set them in water and do this with the water. And baptismal fonts in Orthodox Church are about this big around, about that big. And a lot of baptismal fonts in medieval churches, before they put the lids on them, or they talked about lids on them, were large vessels, going back to a time when they sat the baby in the water.
So when did they stop baptizing in rivers and stuff?
In the early church, as soon as they started building buildings.
oh, when I lived in Texas, or after wrestling, after I broke my neck, I went back down there a couple of years later. My mom was down there, but she was living with my brother, and then my sister-in-law was Christian. However, she was so strict that I couldn't live in there with her. She was like,
Sister?
"You're tattooed all up. You're evil. You're tearing apart my family, and this and that." So I had to go stay with the pastor. The pastor had a building separate building from his house, which he had this big, like, pond-like thing that would go way over your head. But before I left there to come back to South Dakota, he was like, let's baptize you in that water in the lake there, that little pond. You know, actually, pond that's deep or taller than me. It was cold at that time, it was in the middle of winter.
So this was indoor or outdoor water?
Outdoor.
Oh, okay, so
So
it wasn't
he
inside.
said, we're not gonna chance you getting hyperventilation. Or I mean,
Hypothermia.
Hypothermia, yeah.
We're just gonna throw you in the ice.
So I was baptized by immersion in First Christian Church Disciples of Christ.
Mhm.
It was indoors and it was warm, and
Yeah.
I had a special robe to wear, but they put me completely under
Yeah.
and brought me back up because my grandmother did not think I could ever go to heaven if I had not been done,
Yeah.
you know, and she did it without my parents' permission. Oh, yeah, my grandparents just knew I was gonna go to hell.
Ooh, that is
I
why
had not been
donuts are
baptized.
holy.
I got baptized in the Teen
Donut,
Challenge.
donut.
Pardon?
I got baptized in Teen Challenge, they make you do it.
Yes.
Was that what that was in Texas?
No, this was a Teen Challenge in the Dakotas, South
Okay.
Dakota. You
Um,
get baptized in front of everybody.
That's neat.
Big tub.
the,
In
I
the
mean,
wall?
the struggle, I mean, the same with communion, by the way. Because communion in the early church, and we know this from 1 Corinthians, started out as essentially a potluck. Although Paul's criticism of the people in Corinth was not, it wasn't the potluck where they set everything up. It was like people ate their own lunches that they brought, and then and that was the Eucharist, and they, Paul's criticism is the wealthy, you know, get drunk because they've got, you know, lots of wine, and while the poor folks sit around looking at them because they don't have anything. Paul says if you're going to do that, don't do it. So the church very early went to just bread and wine. They did that because the offering, part of it was the offering in ancient Greek, particularly Greek and Roman culture, was not, while coins were used, most people did trade. And so if you were going to bring your offering to church, you brought bread for the poor, bread and wine and olive oil for the poor. And whoever, the deacon would grab some of the bread and wine that was brought to distribute to the people in need, and use that as the offering. And it's something I want to develop us to do here is to bring forward the bread and wine for communion with the offering. To connect back to the fact that that's part of our offering because the early church, it was bread, wine, and olive oil, which if they were going to anoint someone, they just took some of the olive oil that was brought for distributing to the poor. And then in the Catholic Church, because of the notion of transubstantiation, this is literally the body and blood of Christ. Those silly lay people, you know, sometimes they spill the wine. What are we going to do? Well, we won't let them have any wine.
Just the body with no blood.
Yep. So, as is true yet today in the Roman Catholic Church, the laity only get bread.
There's no communion.
The priest drinks the wine, the lay people just get wafers.
And this is all because Luther spilled it.
No, it's because
Lex
it
Luther.
had nothing to do with Luther. This started way
Lex
before
Luther.
Luther, but lay people, you know, because they could be, you know, stumble with the chalice or whatever, and it slops out and gets on the floor, and you know, Luther, his first communion, he spilled some of the wine. He got down on his hands and knees and lapped it up off the floor.
His dad made fun of him for it.
Well, his dad never wanted him to be a priest, and so, but anyway, that's how, and then Luther said, no, the practice of the early church was that everybody gets both bread and wine. And so Protestant churches have always had both bread and wine. In the Eastern Church, they handled all this completely different. The Eastern Church, they break up the bread into the chalice, and serve the Eucharist to you on a spoon.
The Orthodox?
Yes.
That's not the way I remember learning it in Christian history.
That's how they did distribute communities.
Is that the way the Russian Orthodox do it?
Yeah, I mean, any of the Orthodox groups. Generally speaking, anyway. So, but what I'm saying, historically, the church has kind of kept narrowing stuff down. You go from a full meal to just a little bit of bread and wine. Water goes from being lots of water to down to a sprinkle. And part of modern worship trends is to try to we don't turn the Eucharist into a full-blown meal, but we try to use real bread as opposed to the styrofoam little wafers. A professor of liturgy at seminary said, you know, it takes more faith to believe that those things are bread than it is to believe they're the body of Christ.
It really tasted like styrofoam.
Well, and you didn't grow up with what I grew up with the really paper thin wafers that stuck to the roof of your mouth. And
Yes.
the minute you got them in the mouth, they immediately went to the roof of your mouth, and then you just had this kind of
You had to peel it off with your tongue.
I do
Kind of had a film on the top.
almost, and then it got slimy, and it was just, yeah. I like the ones that they at least are a little more like bread, but I love the fact that we generally use actual bread.
And bread tastes good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it was Luther that was one of the things of the Reformation was the cup given back to the laity, and that was true of all of the other thing that happened, and again this minimalization in the church was in the age of pietism, in about the 17th century, when 17th and 18th centuries, when things moved away from the sacrament and it was all about what I felt in the heart. And the age of pietism has, and we'll see this in the United States a lot because, you know, the founding of the country happened at about this time, was it all became internal. And what we felt was the thing. And the sacraments kind of went away. And so in this country and around the world, we ended up with things like what I grew up with, and that was communion 4 times a year. Even though Luther did communion every week. And that continued for quite a while until people said, this sacramental stuff, I don't need that. I just need to me and Jesus. And so they, you know, the church has been struggling to recover. I mean, it was delightful to walk into an ELCA Lutheran church that did weekly communion. A lot of ELCA Lutheran churches is once a month. And nowhere do I know that they do it 4 times a year anymore. But many places it's once a month or every other week. You know, it depends on the church. But to walk into a church where the tradition has already been established of doing weekly communion was wonderful to me. Because that was part of the thing I liked about the Episcopal Church.
Something more special though when they did it once a month at Broadway Methodist, it was a bigger deal.
It is, and it is.
To me it was.
Well, and I think I told this class that my mother and I had an argument about frequency of communion because she thought it was less special if it was more often. I find it more and more powerful.
I'm just saying for me personally.
Right, I understand that, and it was true for my mother as well. But generally speaking, I believe that frequency of communion is a positive thing and deepens our relationship with Jesus.
I do believe that.
And again, it's personal, and you know, there's nothing that says that if you, even though you're at church and we're doing communion, that you have to partake. That's another thing that we should probably, and I should probably say that once in a while, because sometimes you just don't feel like it. There's been a few times in my life where I had so much going on and was not in a space, you know,
Actually,
that I,
Astronaut.
to do, to feel like I was approaching the sacrament with any sense of reverence,
But isn't that the time you need to take it the most?
maybe. But what I'm saying is, it should be a choice that's left to people. It's like a friend that was a Baptist pastor, he said, yeah, we believe in adult baptism, but he says every time a kid hits the age of 12, they want to get baptized, because that was kind of the age in which they did baptism. There was so much social pressure in the church for them to get baptized, that's when they got baptized.
yeah, well, that's what the church said was the age of accountability.
Right.
Yeah, that's really the pressure.
And so he said, even though we don't, he said, you can't affirm that it's a choice that somebody reaches if they're pressured into it. So I got another friend of mine, that he was a musician. He belonged to this Pentecostal church, and speaking in tongues was a big deal. And finally, one Sunday, he mumbled a bunch of nonsense, and he knew it was nonsense, but there was so much pressure to speak in tongues in that church, he did.
He did.
Nothing that we do in church should be because of social pressure of any kind. It ought to be about our relationship with God and nothing else. So, what I want to say is that everything that we do should be open, not closed, and not defining for other people what they need, but rather letting them choose. Okay. I think we'll meet one more time. I was going to talk about law and gospel and some theological things, and we got sidetracked. Well, I got sidetracked. Debbie with her esoteric questions here.
Yeah, well,
That's all right.
Yeah, which
That's why we're here.
I knew that would probably, I should have known that would be a question that someone would have, because it's a question we all struggle with.
Well, apparently, I didn't know I struggled so badly with it until after all that.
Well, and,
Well, after, because see, here's the deal, I'll just, as I grew up in Southern Baptist, there was heaven and hell, and I was pretty well sure all from heaven. And then, this Presbyterian preacher came along and tells me differently, and then I forgot, I don't think it was you, I think it must have been Pastor Sconiello talking about the resurrection thing. And I thought, well, I wonder what Lutheran people do, I wonder where they think we go. If Presbyterians think we sleep until the resurrection, where's the Lutheran? And then it came to the back of my mind, I don't know, I've been thinking about that too, really, about that. I mean, it kind of came along, I guess it was All Saints Day last year.
Yeah, do we have our November 1st?
Not November 1st, so All Saints Day is the one feast of the church year that gets moved to the Sunday immediately following.
Immediately.
November
Yeah.
4th is.
So
All
November
Saints.
4th will be All Saints.
It'll be right after Reformation.
Yeah. And Reformation will be, Sunday will be the previous Sunday. I need to email Pat and let her know to be sure to get the lessons for Reformation Sunday out of Saints and Seasons and not the one for the whatever Sunday after Pentecost.
Oh, yeah.
Because that whatever Sunday after Pentecost is what comes up first, and it's hard to dig into it far enough to get it.
Yeah. Because that's the reason I was asking you about the Amazing Grace one, song, because, well, so we may have to, I'll pay attention to that in the morning.
Going back to what you were saying about what happens, I think one thing that's helped me to ease a lot of my questions is you gotta take time out of your person. And as humans, we are so
Yeah.
Also
about
true.
that, every minute, every day, every hour. But that's just our perception of life, but when we die, time is irrelevant. So if you're laying in the ground until Jesus comes and may not, you know, and then when I die, then maybe tomorrow instantly we're all of us, even my children, we're already in that, but there's no
Yeah.
passage of time.
Uh-huh.
And I think that's one of the greatest obstacles in trying to figure out our faith and what the meaning of life is. Time gets in the way. Because time is not the constant that we think it is.
Mhm.
And
That's,
You're right.
and that's a key point. And you made me think of this because it's important. We think of time as linear, and time really isn't linear, and even physics even shows us that. Time is more of a loop. And that, and in Christian, in the terms of there's chronos time, which is clock time and calendar time. There's also what is known as kairos time. The book is a biblical term in Greek. Kairos is a Greek word. But kairos is the right time. The time when everything comes together, or that sort of thing. And so God often works on kairos time, not linear clock time. And so when we the word of remembrance, do this in remembrance of me, the Greek word is anamnesis. Anamnesis is not just a recalling, but it's something that comes in, something from the past that comes into the present moment. I'll never forget this. We had bought my ex-business partner and I had bought a building, and we pulled up the carpeting in the living room of this apartment building, and we were gonna refinish the floors and have hardwood floor. Pulled up the carpeting, and it was practically pristine floor. I said, we're not gonna sand this and start over. But I said, it does need a fresh coat of varnish, and we needed to use varnish, not urethane, because it was old-fashioned varnish that was on the floor. I opened that can of varnish, and I was back in my grandmother's dining room. I mean, it wasn't just recalling her dining room, it was like I was actually there, because she, every year in the summertime, she would, when it was hot and humid and sticky, she'd use a knife to scrape the old varnish off, because it would get soft and gluey in hot, humid weather, and then she'd put fresh varnish on, and that smell of that darn varnish, hadn't smelled it in years, because nobody had used varnish for a long time. I was literally back in her dining room. And that's what should be happening to us in communion. It's not just remembering something that happened, but something that's happened. We'll wrap that up there, and we'll take up any other questions. 2 weeks from today is, in fact, All Saints Sunday. Do we have anything else? I don't believe we have anything else going on.
I don't.
That Sunday.
Well, that's the 4th,
Yeah.
and I have a meeting at 2 o'clock about it, so I might not be able to stay for a long period of time.
Well, I would like to.
Oktoberfest?
That's the day after the women's retreat.
Okay.
Is that when Oktoberfest is? or-
No, Oktoberfest is this Saturday.
Or this Saturday?
At
It's this
4
Saturday
o'clock.
at 4 o'clock.
At 4 o'clock.
Yeah, it makes sense to be in October.
We will meet on Sunday, the 4th of, and hopefully I can not have us go all over the place like we did today.
I won't have any, Pastor, I'll just ask you when I see you.
Well, and I was catching up some stuff that I'd forgotten to address last time, and so today was a catch-up day.
In theory, you could hold all questions and see Jesus and ask him.
You could
You
do
might
that,
know.
but it's not as much fun as talking about it now.
Well,
No,
we have that way we'll have a little bit of conversation with Jesus when we get there.
When you get to heaven, ask
I
around.
just got a feeling, here's what you got wrong, and pulls up a huge list.
Yeah, here it is.
Right.